You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda from New York City.
And this is Prashant Parmaswaran from Washington, D.C.
How are you doing today, Prashant?
Good. How are you doing?
Doing well. It's good to be back with you as always. We took a little bit of a break of the podcast because of
That's right.
some unanticipated illnesses on my part. I was pretty sick, so my voice wasn't too pleasant to listen to, but doing better now and looking forward to joining you as always. So for our listeners, I'll just lay out the topic that we've chosen today, which is something I think we've talked about on the podcast maybe a couple years ago. It's hard to believe, but the podcast is almost going on 5 years now. But the topic I want to talk about today, Prashant, is these recent anti-Chinese protests that we've seen in Vietnam. These protests began a couple weeks ago, just actually after the Trump-Kim summit, so not really... they weren't really grabbing the top headlines in most of the Western media, but for us at the Diplomat, we watch Asia closely, so this obviously was quite notable. Protests took place across the country, Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh City, over a new draft law in Vietnam that would authorize special economic zones that would allow for long-term leasing of land, effectively on a 99-year leases. And this and the protesters, their primary grievances here had to do with the idea of Vietnam effectively selling out its sovereignty to China. We can debate whether that's exactly what the draft law does and how pertinent these risks are, but certainly to some of our listeners, these perceptions will sound quite familiar. Vietnam is not the first country where we've seen popular unrest around these issues. We saw protests earlier in Sri Lanka. We've seen similar grievances elsewhere in Southeast Asia. But Prashant, also, these aren't the first anti-Chinese protests in Vietnam. We can talk about the 2014 episode over the South China Sea with the oil rig incident, which was another pretty notable example. But Prashant, just focusing in on this episode, do you want to walk us through a bit of what's really behind these protests? Where are they coming from? Where do these grievances really stem from in Vietnam?
Sure, absolutely. And I think, the starting point that you provided there was very useful in terms of the fact that these protests actually broke out in the early part of June, but were actually initially kind of off the radar for most of the major news outlets until they sort of got bigger and ballooned a little bit, and there started to be a number of violent incidents and arrests, and then they sort of bubbled up to the surface, and then they sort of made the big headlines. I think you're sort of right to place the primary focus on anti-Chinese sentiment, right? Because you and I have talked about this in the context of other countries, and also on the South China Sea, for example. This anti-Chinese sentiment in Vietnam is something that's very deeply rooted, right? It's, the Chinese have effectively colonized Vietnam for about 1,000 years. In the older period, and even now, 40 years ago, these countries were basically, at war essentially, and they still have outstanding disputes on the South China Sea, and those kind of bubble up from time to time. The last time was the sort of oil rig incident that you mentioned. So this is kind of a really deeply rooted sentiment. I think these protests in particular were on a particular slice of that sentiment, which is that the Vietnamese government has been trying to draw Chinese investment into Vietnam as part of Vietnam's effort at broader economic development. So Vietnam's one of the most prosperous Asian economies, actually. Growth rate over the last decade has been over 6%. So this is a country which is growing quite rapidly, but part of that, and an increasingly part of that, is due to China. But as they're trying to seek more of these Chinese investment, the Vietnamese people there's nationalist resentment about the extent to which the Chinese are, perceived to be taking over Vietnamese territory. But there's also sentiment regarding at the local level about pollution, about harassment of fishermen, about environmental disasters that have happened because of the Chinese. So there really is a lot of pent-up frustration regarding China. I think one thing that I would flag that I think you suggested earlier on is that, we don't actually know to what degree this is only about China, right?
Right.
One thing about Vietnam that is different from some of the other countries that we've been covering is that, there are all kinds and ranges of opposition to the government that doesn't get covered by the state media as opposition to the government. It's sort of anti-Chinese protests, but there are also protests and opposition with respect to the cybersecurity law that they were passing. There was also frustration about local governance. So there's multiple layers to this, but I mean, there definitely is sort of this deep anti-Chinese sentiment that you and I have been talking about before as well. So.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I want to drill in a bit on the the economic relationship because China is a major partner for Vietnam. Even though trade volumes did dip a bit in 2017, they've been rising until 2016. Vietnam is the poorest country to participate in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership now,
Hmm.
and it's certainly a country that is thinking quite actively about balancing China in the region, and we see that with its military to military diplomacy with countries like the United States, Japan, India, along a range of issues. But the one of the things that I really think is worth digging into here is the effect to which the end to which these kinds of popular outbursts in Vietnam that are partly nationalistic, partly anti-government, as you correctly noted.
Hmm.
I wonder the extent to which these actually will end up moving the needle on how Vietnam approaches China. In 2014, we sort of had the flip side a case study, right? I mean, then we had a pretty acute cause and effect. We had the oil rig incident in the South China Sea, fanning sort of nationalist sentiment in Vietnam over sovereignty issues, and that led to violence against Chinese businesses, ethnic Chinese in Vietnamese cities, and that actually led the Vietnamese government to take the issue of de-escalating that crisis with China more seriously at the time. Instead of sort of further fanning those fears. So, do you see a similar effects at play this time, or do you think sort of some of the criticisms of the government that are at play here make this more of a domestic issue for the Vietnamese government, and they'll instead look to continue these arrests and continue to crack down?
Yeah, I think that's a key question. It's something that I think it's maybe too early to assess that right now, but we have seen some indicators about that moving the needle somewhat. I mean, the first is that these protests actually resulted in the vote in the National Assembly for this piece of legislation that we're talking about for special economic zones. That was actually delayed till October. So there was some sign that these protests in effect, represented for the government something that they needed to at least sort of let cool down. There's also been a range of high-profile political officials that have come to the fore and have spoken on state media to say, sort of let's cool this thing down, let's not be violent, and we take the needs and the opinions of the Vietnamese people very seriously. And so you can sense that the Vietnamese officials are quite jittery about how they're managing this. The issue for Vietnam, though, is that as we've both been mentioning here, the special economic zones that they're trying to set up, the reason why they're doing that is because they're trying to boost economic growth, and that's been made more difficult by the fact that you've had things like, Vietnam trying to diversify and rely on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but that hasn't quite panned out to the degree that Vietnam wanted. So it's had to rely on the Chinese, I think, to more of a degree than it wants. But there's these costs that they have to bear. I think one of the other interesting pieces to this is to what extent this affects how Vietnam treats the South China Sea issue or how it deals with China in other realms of the relationship. The Vietnamese like to say that, they're able to manage various aspects of the relationship with China very well, and they're able to balance that. But we've seen a number of incidents, and you and I have written about this, at the Diplomat and elsewhere, where the Vietnamese have come under great pressure from China on the South China Sea issue. And so balancing that sort of security relationship or security tensions with the economic relationship is another aspect of this that I think is very difficult to manage.
Absolutely, and of course, there you're probably referring to the incidents earlier this year and last year over hydrocarbon exploration and oil blocks in the disputed portions of their EEZs. For listeners that aren't aware, we have some pretty good evidence through reporting done by Bill Hayton, one of the sharpest South China Sea watchers out there that China directly pressured the Vietnamese government to get Repsol, the Spanish oil company, to back off of a major exploration project in the South China Sea. It's a pretty sharp example of China using economic coercion to affect Vietnam's right to exploit its own economic zone in the South China Sea as it sees fit. Yeah, I think that's absolutely a valid point here too, to see how we see an interaction between these protests and how Vietnam behaves in the South China Sea. But to go back to the actual core grievance here, we see these protests against China effectively leasing land, and in some cases, there are, I think, good reasons for local populations to be quite upset. I think, if we compare, at the beginning of the podcast, I compared the Sri Lanka and the Vietnamese examples a little bit, but I think they're actually quite different in an important way, which is that in Sri Lanka, you actually have pretty good evidence that Chinese investments in Hambantota were predatory and, harmful for the community, harmful for the country. So those protests, when you look at them, clearly, the cause and effect there makes sense. And I'm not trying to, say that the Vietnamese protesters here don't have a point necessarily, but this more seems to me, has to do with the perception among many of these protesters that Vietnam's political elites are effectively, in China's pocket. They're selling out the country to China without even, seeing what can come from this, right? I mean, the Vietnamese government's position in defense of these, in defense of the draft law and in defense of, prospective projects in these special economic zones would be that, yes, these aren't going to be projects that end up putting Vietnam in a hole, but they'll actually be quite beneficial for us economically. So that, I think, is an important difference that, we don't really see as part of the discussion. I mean, really what's at play here is sort of nationalism, I think, and sort of long brewing anti-Chinese sentiment. Because, these special economic zones could be just as easily open to any other country in the region. It's just that China is the largest actor and has the most capital to bear, so it's obviously going to be the primary concern for a lot of these protesters.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a really important point to note, that the actual legislation, in fact, doesn't mention China even once, and it, in fact, doesn't mention any country, because it's left open to whoever's interested in investing. And I think the other aspect that you mentioned is really important as well, because there really is very little distinction in terms of how these protests play out, in terms of whether the grievances are, for example, in some of these incidents, in Binh Thuan, for example, which was a major hotbed of these protests, there are very specific examples of industrial pollution and land disputes that are related to what the Chinese are doing. But it's unclear, and sometimes it can be conflated, whether the protesters are actually angrier at the Chinese for what they're doing, or they're angrier at the local government and the Vietnamese government for actually allowing the Chinese to do what they're doing as well. So there is that sort of line that is not really that clear in this case.
Yeah, absolutely. And one last thing before we wrap up the discussion is, I wonder about the counterfactual scenario where Vietnamese nationalism and anti-Chinese sentiment today in 2018 would be at a much lower level, I think, if the whole 2014 incident didn't happen with the oil rig. I think that was actually quite an important development that I think has sort of sown in this anti-Chinese sentiment. So to the extent that the grievances have to do with concerns specifically about China, I think it's interesting that, China's sort of heavy-handed behavior in the South China Sea has sort of fed back and created this issue now where further attempts at economic cooperation with Southeast Asian countries are going to be beset by this kind of sentiment. I don't think this is the last time we're going to see this happen, and I don't think Vietnam's the only country where we're going to see this kind of sentiment come to play.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think the unfortunate thing as well is that, China is not only affecting these countries, but you see these unintended effects as well, right? Like, so during the oil rig incident, for example, it was not just Chinese firms that were affected, it was Taiwanese firms too. And in this case, with the protests, it was not only Chinese plants and factories that closed down, it was also Taiwanese factories that closed down because there was confusion as to whether they were Chinese or Taiwanese too. So there is that sort of element as well there, that you have unintended effects on other aspects of development.
Yeah, I guess that's sort of a perverse way for the protesters to hold to the one China principle. But yeah, I think I think this is something we'll want to keep an eye on, though. Not a lot of people have been talking about it this month, just given other hotline issues. But this is, I think, one of those issues that is going to rear its head again, and is going to be quite significant in the geopolitics of the region.
Absolutely.
All right, Prashant. Well, thanks a lot for joining me today.
Good to be with you.
Absolutely. And so the podcast will probably take a short hiatus just for our listeners. So I'm actually going to be in South Korea for a couple weeks to listen to what actual Koreans have to say about the Singapore summit and the Panmunjom summit in April and the process of implementation there. So I'll be hoping to share some impressions from my trip when I return. But in the meantime, if you haven't subscribed to the podcast, please do so you can keep up with future episodes when they come out. And if you have subscribed for a while but you haven't left us a review yet, please do so as well. It really helps get the word out about the show. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back soon.